Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Joyner, Senior Program Manager here at NCNK, the National Committee on North Korea, and thank you for joining today's webinar, an Ambassadors Roundtable featuring both reflections and thoughts on the future of diplomacy in Pyongyang. For those of you new to the organization, NCNK is an NGO working to promote peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and improve the lives of the North Korean people. NCNK is a non-governmental, nonpartisan organization whose membership reflects a broad range of perspectives and subject matter expertise related to North Korea. NCNK serves to share information among its members, advance their work, and provide the broader public with substantive and balanced information about North Korea. Today's webinar will be moderated by Ambassador Kathleen Stevens. Kathleen Stevens is a former American career diplomat. She was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011, the first woman and first Korean speaker in that position. She served in numerous senior positions at the Department of State and the White House, and at American diplomatic posts in Asia and Europe. She is currently chair of the board of directors of the Korea Society and vice chair of the board of trustees of the Asia Foundation. I'd like to turn it over now to Ambassador Stevens to further introduce our guest speakers, whom we are also very pleased to welcome today, and then to jump into leading what is sure to be an insightful discussion on diplomacy in Pyongyang. Over to you, Ambassador Stevens.
Seth, thank you very much. And hello to everybody. Good morning from Washington, D.C., where I am. And I really am pleased to join this webinar. It's another great program by NCNK, whose work I so admire. The title, of course, is A New Era of Diplomacy in Pyongyang. And I suppose sitting here in Washington, D.C., if I went out on the street right now and said, we're talking about that, people would say, well, when is Trump going to meet with Kim Jong-un or something like that? But this is really not about American diplomacy, although in a way it's about diplomacy at large. And it's also about diplomacy as I think I trust my colleagues who are going to speak with us today, really think about on the ground diplomacy, what you do as ambassadors in capitals, how you help to shape and implement policy. And perhaps there's nowhere more challenging in some ways than doing that in Pyongyang. I was ambassador to South Korea. My two colleagues I'm going to introduce now were both representing their countries in North Korea in the DPRK before the COVID-19 shutdown. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is now almost 5 years since North Korea closed its borders due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's slowly reopening. So I think it's a time to reflect on their experience and what that kind of on-the-ground diplomacy, that kind of representation capitals do to move forward on some very difficult issues, and also to see what the prospects are for not only the return of some of these missions, but what the focus needs to be and what we need to look for, how things have changed, and much, much else. So just to briefly introduce, first we have Ambassador Alastair Morgan, who a career diplomat, now retired, a British diplomat who had postings in Japan, China, and the DPRK, where he was Her Majesty's ambassador from 2015 to 2018, representing the United Kingdom. And subsequently, I believe, served on the UN panel of experts on DPRK sanctions. So we look forward to your insights on that multilateral diplomatic effort as well. He's now affiliated with King's College London and the University of Tokyo, and he's joining us from Tokyo now, where I know it's very late, so thank you for joining us. Also joining us is Ambassador Thomas Schäfer, also a retired career diplomat with some extraordinary variety of postings: Beijing, San Salvador, Hong Kong, Guatemala, where he was ambassador, I'm envious, Caracas, Seoul, and twice, not once, but twice, I don't know if you're unique in that, at least among Western embassies, twice ambassador to the DPRK, the German ambassador to the DPRK 2007 to 2010, and again 2013 to 2018. He's written a book, which I have not read, but I hope is in English, but I'm going to read it, Political History of North Korea 2007 to 2020, How the Hardliners Prevailed, which I hope he'll talk about. So with that, again, just in terms of scene setting, I also should mention, since I'm the American here, that I think as people joining this webinar probably know, the US does not have official diplomatic relations with the DPRK. There have been efforts over the decades to, as in a way we did with China and elsewhere, to have an intersection, which was part of the agreed framework, as well as the six-party talks. We never got to the point of opening a mission and only had intermittent visits, of course, to Pyongyang, but never a diplomatic presence. I think the European countries who did establish relations in the 1990s have played a very important role over the years. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that, both in terms of their own bilateral engagement with the DPRK and the broader international effort to bring our relations with the DPRK to a different place. Since the slight reopening or the reopening of borders by North Korea, I understand there has been some return of resident diplomats, China, Russia, Mongolia, Cuba, maybe some others. Much has changed, of course, in the geopolitical situation, but what we're going to talk about today, I think, is that presence on the ground and how that relates both then and perhaps now and looking forward to, as I said, our broader effort. So with that, I thought I would ask each ambassador to say a few words to kind of start off about their experience, what they're looking at now, the prospects, and then we just want to have a conversation. So over to you, Ambassador Morgan. I should also add, sorry, before that Ambassador Schäfer is joining us from Germany, so we really are spanning the globe here, and thank you for joining us at a rather later hour as well. So Ambassador Morgan, please.
Well, Ambassador Stevens, Kathy, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to NCNK for organizing this event and all the other events that you do organize and the things you do. I was, as you said, in Pyongyang from December 2015 to December 2018. And during part of that time, Thomas was not only a good colleague there, he was also my landlord because the British Embassy was co-located in the German embassy. My time there was dominated by the events of 2016 and 2017, when you had 3 nuclear tests and an accelerating program of missile launches. And as a result of that, we're very much focused on that. They're also focused on human rights issues. And sadly, I had to close down a lot of the programs that we were operating. We didn't have very many big programs, but we had some humanitarian programs and a British Council program, which we shut down. And we also spent a fair amount of time on contingency planning in case we had to leave, which we didn't at that time. So working on issues in Pyongyang, we were reporting what we could see when we traveled around Pyongyang, when we met officials, and we had limited contacts, but we had contacts up to the level of foreign minister in my case. And I was also traveling outside North Korea to travel to capitals where allied countries, friendly countries, didn't have missions in Pyongyang. In terms of what has changed, I've not been back since I left in 2018, and the British embassy has not yet reopened. Though I know my successor would like to reopen and keeps working on that. I think things that have changed, of course, are the entire geopolitical situation. And I think that would affect the relations that one could have in there in working with colleagues from China and from Russia. When I was there, we were pretty much in the same place on the Security Council, though of course there were differences of view. Anyone who goes back is going to have the difficult job of starting up again, because when people withdrew, of course, they didn't just leave everything to be started up. When you come back, you'd have to bring back in all your kit and so on. And they will get back to a very diminished diplomatic corps and almost no NGO presence on the ground. So it's going to be a very, very different atmosphere there. And I think there are many things that we can talk about, and I look forward to the discussion as we go on.
Thank you, Alastair. Thomas, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Yeah, I was in Pyongyang from 2007 to 10. That was Kim Jong-il still. And then from 2013 and to 18, in between, I was in Guatemala. and of course, one of I had been in China in the 80s. That was my first posting. And I was responsible in the German embassy at that time for the reporting on internal policy in the Chinese leadership. And so I witnessed the beginning of the reforms by Deng Xiaoping and the resistance by hardliners led by Chen Yun at that time, and I think that really made me susceptible to the tendency to the policy in North Korea, but because I was always looking it under the same angle, are there contradictions within the leadership? And for me in Pyongyang, the first interesting event or happening was that I had just arrived. There was a flood, and Germany and other countries delivered aid, and we were thanked by the leadership. But at the same time, there were commentaries in the official newspapers that said, "Beware of humanitarian aid. They are just a vehicle to introduce Western ideas." And so that was one of the big themes that accompanied me in Pyongyang during the years, looking out for contradictions within the leadership. And I found, I believe, quite a few. That they started under Kim Jong-il, intensified after his stroke in 2008. Then I was away from 2010 to 13 during the handover of power to a new set of leaders, as I believe, in Pyongyang, and they continued up to the end of 2015, and there were contradictions in lots of policy fields, really, and so that became my favorite pastime during work, I guess, to watch out for these contradictions, and now this also determined the way we in the diplomatic corps worked. We tried, I believe, I tried to establish links to officials, talking repeatedly with them, always about the same subjects, more or less, because a limited number of subjects, and always asking the same questions, and of course gaining their trust. And so I believe that being on the ground there and talking with people, watching what is going on, what is happening to the population, one can gain insights that one cannot gain outside of North Korea, and so that is the exciting thing and interesting thing about being in Pyongyang, and therefore that is the main reason I'm very glad now that hopefully, or if the Western missions will be reopened again, sooner or later it will happen, I guess. I hope sooner, but I know there's lots of resistance in the leadership against accepting again diplomats from Western countries, but I think it's necessary in order to better understand what is happening in North Korea. Yeah, perhaps only that.
Yeah, thank you. I want to follow up on that in a number of ways, but I'm kind of thinking as I look at both of you and your span in Pyongyang. I mean, we're basically talking about well, a period beginning. I guess Alastair, you were there. You got there in 2007 the first time, and then both of you have seen it right through the following decade, and here we are now. Some years after that, after the lockdown. When you were there, and what did you feel like the North Korean authorities wanted from you? Did they see having your missions there as a burden, as a as a kind of a challenge, or were there things, and did it vary? I mean, Thomas, you talked about, I mean, a variety of views, which again is an important thing, but can you talk a little bit more about that? And that also kind of feeds into, you mentioned this notion of, reform and how you saw that happen in China. And we were talking before we started the webinar. I was in China in 1980 as well, when I saw the reform and opening. And in my time of working on North Korea from Washington, there was always a sense of, we're all going to encourage a China-like process or a Vietnam-like process and economic. Did you see attitudes about this change over the time that you were there? And do you have an assessment of where things are now? I mean, because the debate now is, I mean, are they really interested, or can the regime actually survive that sort of reform process? I realize there's a lot of questions there, but I really just want to encourage just a discussion about some of those themes.
Kathy, thank you. If I could come in, and then I'd be very interested to hear Thomas's comment. I felt that the North Korean officials I met wanted us to be there as a presence, and there were occasional times when they wanted specific things from me or from the United Kingdom. I mean, sometimes if a problem blew up, they wanted to talk about a problem. They would have liked us to be doing all sorts of things that we weren't doing, like putting in more business and more investment. They didn't really want necessarily to talk to us about the things we wanted to talk to them about, which were our objections to the nuclear program. And that was, one of the values of being there, was to be able to say these things that you felt wouldn't be relayed to them otherwise. The other thing they wanted was their own missions overseas. And so the part of the benefit for them of tolerating our presence in Pyongyang was that they had a mission in London and other European capitals.
If I may, I would like to say that I think perhaps, Alastair, you came in 2015 until 18, and I believe things had been decided in 2000 at the end at least of 2015. It was quite clear that North Korea didn't want to continue with any substantial reforms anymore. It was I believe there was a power struggle in the years before, where all these questions had been discussed in the leadership, and I believe in 2015, at least at the end of 2015, the essential questions had been decided in the sense of, and the hardliners had really prevailed. What I found, especially during my first term in Pyongyang, from 2007 to 2010, but also later during the second term, there were people that indeed tried to institute some kind of reform and opening up policy, and they wanted our help with it up to a degree. And there were other people that didn't want to have any of that. Very much like the situation in China in the 80s. I remember, for example, a talk with the general that was in 2007 or 2008 perhaps, and I asked him about we continuously at that time talked about the six-party talks, when also China was pushing for some form of opening and reform. And so I asked that general, well, all the things that Kim Jong-il is promising and you are negotiating, what does the military, what do the armed forces think about it? And he started to laugh and said, well, we let him, that is Kim Jong-il, do as he pleases, but you can be assured that we watch very carefully, and we will know how to defend our interests. And that was quite chilling, actually, because it was, he didn't say it with much respect of Kim Jong-il at that time, but he said it, and it was quite clear that he didn't he and the armed forces didn't like at least part of what the negotiations were about. And during my first stint in Pyongyang, there was also already the discussion about the special economic zone of Kaesong, the South Korean economic zone on North Korean territory. And the military effectively closed Kaesong for a couple of days in 2009 for the first time. That was repeated later on in 2013, but then it was a couple of months. So there was a discussion going on between the military and part of the party establishment and other people that were reformers. I later on, during my second stint, I once talked with a member of the Politburo, very high ranking and really part of the leadership, and he had wanted to talk with me. We had later on he was going to Europe and Germany, and well, he simply wanted to talk about reform and about my impressions about North Korea. And then I told him about a seminar that had been organized by an NGO and that about business practices and improving business. And that seminar was programmed to last 2 days, but it was shut down by the security forces after the first days. And on the second day, the North Korean participants didn't appear anymore, and they were and the Germans were told, well, they had to go to rice planting or rice harvesting, something like this. And so I told that to this guy, and he started to laugh, and I laughed too. And then I asked him, "Do you want to know what I really think?" And he said, "Yes. What do you really think?" And I said, "Well, I believe some people here want to," and we were talking about opening up and reform, "and other people don't want to." And he said, "Yeah." He nodded and said, "Yeah, that's true. And we have to change. We have to change that." So it was at that time, it was quite evident that there were contradictions and struggles within the leadership. And they fought about different themes. It was South Korea policy, economic policy, opening up, security, was even about the national budget, about the question how much money should be given to the military, etc. So I believe that at that time, up to 2015, perhaps, some people in the leadership wanted us to somehow help them to develop develop an initial set of reform policy and to help them. Yeah, but of course, as you said, we also continuously began shutting down our programs, and so our influence waned over the years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Fascinating you could have these discussions, and that's 2015. I want to ask you both again. Well, I mean, this is in the context of I realize there's still limitations on to what extent you and your staff could get out and about and talk to people, but still you did, and there is something about living there. And I actually am curious too about how much more constrained perhaps you found it than perhaps China at an earlier time or other places where you've served. But within that context, what's your sense about how, I mean, both, I guess, the North Korean elite and leadership see South Korea and how the general population, if you can judge that, says? I mean, I have this sense, I lived in South Korea, that maybe North Korea sees South Korea as kind of an existential threat in a way. It's what being Korean could be like. And maybe that's what constrains them in some ways, from notwithstanding the talk about the security threat from the US and so on, from pursuing the path that Vietnam or China did. That it takes them down the slippery slope towards something that really leads to South Korea, and probably not fast enough. That's kind of my little theory. And that related to that, and I'm just throwing it again, how does sanctions fit into that? And Alastair, I know you've seen them from both the New York perspective as well as the Pyongyang and London perspective, but I'd be curious on your experiences and your thoughts now about that.
Well, in terms of views towards South Korea, I mean, I think we can talk about how that has evolved. I mean, when I was there in 2018, and you'd had the start of the Pyongyang Spring and the North Korean participation in the Winter Olympics in South Korea, and then you were obviously moving on towards the summit in Singapore. There was obviously at that point a lot of contact between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, and I was present when Moon Jae-in came to Pyongyang later in the year. I was sitting behind Kim Jong-un and Moon, a few rows in front in the stadium when Kim allowed Moon to speak to the chosen people in the hall, and what he said was reprinted in the Rodong Sinmun the next day. So there was at that point, despite the concerns you mention, a readiness to reach out to South Korea, and the pixelated images in the stadium showed a through train from South Korea coming into North Korea. The people waiting for news of the international meetings that took place were visibly interested in the relationship with South Korea. Perhaps this is impressionistic, but perhaps even more so than in terms of the relationship with the US. And I think you saw that in things like North Korea accelerating the speed of announcement of meetings and the outcome of meetings. All that has now been stopped for reasons of great concern. So I'm going to leave it there rather than talk about sanctions, because I think Thomas might want to come in on those points, and I'll come back to sanctions afterwards, if that's all right, Kathy.
Yeah.
Okay, he knows me too well. I believe that in Pyongyang, I was always speaking, no, not always, but occasionally, on occasions. For example, the Day of German Unity, I was speaking about German unification. And after one of those pep talks, a North Korean functionary came to me and told me, we really don't want to hear about that anymore. He was fed up. They came anyhow because they liked the German sausages we brought from Beijing on such occasions. But they didn't want it. But that really is the point. The North Korean regime has studied German unification as well as the Arab Spring, but especially the German unification in detail, of course. And they have noticed that what happened in Germany was that the East German demonstrators in the streets, they started shouting, "We are the people." Against they wanted to tell the East German government at that time that it's them who make the decisions, have to make the decisions, and not their government. They didn't accept the government. But at one point, the slogan turned from "we are the people" into "we are one people," because and at that point they had understood, the East Germans had understood that the easiest path to a better life economically and politically was through reunification, as simple as that. And the North Koreans know that. And so what you said about the existential threat, yeah, that is very true. I also believe that. South Korea is in the mere existence of South Korea. As long as South Korea exists, it constitutes, in the view of the North Korean leadership, an existential threat, because as soon as there is instability in North Korea, they fear that the North Korean population might simply decide, okay, we now want to get rid of all of that here and simply want to be part of South Korea, of a united Korea. And that is, I believe, the main threat. That is the threat that is considered the greatest threat by the current leadership in North Korea. It is not the fear of an attack by the US or South Korea or whoever, but it's they mainly fear instability, and the reason that they are less inclined to open up and to reform their economic system, less inclined than China or Vietnam or other countries, is the fact that they are a divided country. Because for them, if they do it, to the difference of China, they always run the risk of disappearing altogether as regime, and therefore that's the view of the leadership in Pyongyang. As to the population, of course, they know what happens and how well off the people in South Korea are, as well as in China, and they just want to change. They would just want better economic life and more personal freedom, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you have the sense, when you were there, that these South Korean K-dramas and the USBs with pop culture were widely available, or hard to judge?
It's very hard to judge. I know they were available in the city, in Pyongyang, but I do not really know how far available they were in the countryside, for example, or in the smaller towns. I've read, of course, what has been written about it, and I've seen the reports by defectors, but I simply do not know.
Right, right.
But the fact, of course, the fact that they know that the South Koreans are much, much better off, and also the Chinese are much better off. That is very clear. And also perhaps they know it better as to China. I mean, for example, Dandong, we have seen the growth of Dandong, like the border city, which has also 1 million inhabitants now or so, and we have seen it over the years, and the people across the river in Sinuiju and the surroundings, that's about 500,000 people also. And so they have seen it. They just have to look across the river to see that city of Dandong grow up and see more lights. And so of course there's widespread knowledge in North Korea that their situation is extremely bad compared to their neighbors.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's return then to, I know I raised sanctions and probably a little bit too early, but because that kind of takes us both into, the continual kind of discussion of sanctions and their efficacy and how they should be used. And secondly, the very change, as we say, geopolitical situation, by which, of course, I mean the partnership, alliance, cooperation, now a close relationship between the DPRK and Russia in particular, but also China and that. In that regard, and I'll turn to Alastair here in a minute, since you saw it on the ground as well as in the UN, where, as has already been said, we don't have the kind of Security Council cooperation we used to say the least of it. I should have mentioned at the outset, but I'll mention now that the Q&A box is open, and I know we have one question already, but please put questions in there, and I will put them to our panelists here in a few moments. But Alastair, go ahead.
So I think you've said it all, really, Kathy, about the Security Council. That the panel of which I was the coordinator, of course, no longer exists because the mandate was blocked by Russian veto with China in Russia's slipstream there. There's still a chance to raise issues related to North Korea on the Security Council. So there's an opportunity to grandstand, but there is no possibility of getting new sanctions designations or sanctions measures through the Security Council. The Security Council sanctions, of course, still remain valid, and there are national sanctions as well. I mean, Japan, South Korea, and others who have their autonomous sanctions, and I'm sure they still have very considerable economic impact on North Korea, despite the relationship with Russia and China and the sanctions evasion that goes on through that. I think that the chances of the sanctions actually leading directly to denuclearization are very, very limited indeed. But that doesn't mean that I would myself advocate lifting them. I mean, on the ground, when I was there, because sanctions take a while to come into effect. I mean, there've been sanctions for a long time, but the sort of comprehensive sanctions that you had from 2016, 2017 were only really coming into effect while I was there, and you didn't really see them biting, particularly on the life of people in Pyongyang. And since then, of course, you had the COVID shutdown, which was a tighter closing of the border than anything that the UN Security Council had imposed. But that's the position as I see it. And I don't know if Thomas wants to add to that, or Kathy, from your perspective, you have anything?
If I may, I would like to add perhaps that I also believe that sanctions are an essential part of the correct approach by the international community, the Western countries mainly now, including Japan and South Korea, of course, as to what to do with North Korea. But one should not. But of course, we know that China and other countries have circumvented them, and so their impact might be more limited than we had wished for. In general, I believe one should not overvalue the impact of economic measures on North Korea. Part of the leadership, and I think essentially the leadership which is in place now, is not interested in foreign investment if it involves personal interchanges with foreigners. They might be interested in receiving money from abroad, because that's on a technical basis, and selling things, selling minerals, but they do not want to come into too close communication with foreigners. And the same holds true for even for humanitarian aid. In the first example I encountered for investment, this aversion against foreign investment was still under Kim Jong-il's rule. That was in 2007, the second Korean summit between the South Korean president and at that time and Kim Jong-il. They had agreed private and public foreign investment in North Korea, but later on, a couple of months later, in a public statement, the New Year's editorial of 2008, the line taken by the government and by the regime at that time was no foreign investment. So what had happened was Kim Jong-il had advanced too far, and he was really called back by some other parts of the leadership at that time, and we saw the same discussion as to Kaesong. The military was simply against the special economic zone of Kaesong. They didn't like it, even and simply wanted to shut out all the foreigners. And so my point here is that the international community and the Western countries have to think about the value of sanctions and the value of economic incentives. Just offering economic incentives to the regime will not change things in North Korea. It might help, but it applies. It's only attractive to a part of the leadership, and that part of the leadership right now is very subdued and doesn't really utter much publicly, at least.
No, if I agree with that, and I've also been struck by how, dare I say, entrepreneurial the North Korean regime has been in finding not only ways of skirting around sanctions, but new sources of income, which may have something to do with why they're not dependent so much on their embassies abroad to generate income. But they, in terms of going into cybercrime,
yeah.
Cryptocurrency, they've really been pretty creative, I think, in finding new sources of income, which may be technically kind of busting sanctions, but ways we haven't been able to reach. So it's a bit of a whack-a-mole. I wanted I'm going to turn to the questions here in a minute. In fact, maybe I will now, because I see some coming up, and then I wanted to follow up a little bit on this, the relationships, the changing relationships. Here's more of an historical question, but I think it's good context because we're talking about a period of decades now, and this is from Chris Kim. He said North Korea was similarly closed pre-1995. How was the breakthrough? And I think he means in terms of diplomatic relations being established, achieved in the late 80s, early 1990s. If I can just kind of preface it, I guess, by saying, I recall the No Tae-woo coming to power as president in South Korea, the end of the Cold War, as we called it, German unification, many things happening in the early 90s that kind of set the stage for it, including both Koreas joining the UN as full members in 1992 with the support of China and this burgeoning relationship with South Korea and China. So a lot of things happening on the world stage, but the establishment, and especially the Europeans, Western Europeans, the EU establishing these relations, maybe each of you could talk a little bit about that in this context.
Well,
go ahead, Alastair.
I'll be brief. And I mean, the UK were not by any means the first to establish a relationship, as Sweden had gone ahead, but with the Sunshine Policy in South Korea, there was encouragement to the United Kingdom and to others to open up in 2001, and it was kind of in response to that South Korean encouragement that Blair and Brown decided or Blair and Cook, actually, the Foreign Secretary Cook, decided to go ahead and to open up the mission in the UK, and that was welcomed from the North Korean side, though it took a little while to get the missions opened and at ambassadorial level. But I'll stop there, Thomas. You come in.
No, it's the same. Actually, we did it quite in parallel. I think Germany was a couple of months later, but also in 2001. And it was also really at the request of the South Korean government in the context of the Sunshine Policy at that time.
Yeah. I've been reading basically the Tae Ho, who was a North Korean diplomat who defected from the UK, from the embassy there several years ago. In his memoir, and again, he says that at that time, the DPRK leadership, Kim Jong-il, was worried after George W. Bush's axis of evil speech about U.S. military intervention in North Korea following on Iraq, and he thought that the UK and presumably other Europeans might be a bit of a braking mechanism on that. I thought it was fascinating as another voice, and maybe you picked up things like that afterwards, or people, but yeah.
I've heard others say that in terms of how the North Koreans read the British presence and what British officials were saying. I didn't experience it myself, so I don't know firsthand. But yeah,
right. All right. I'm going to read. This is from So-young, who's a reporter at RFA. She says, and this gets back to our discussion on changing relationship with Russia. North Korea, which has isolated itself during the pandemic, now strengthening military cooperation with Russia, refusing dialogue with South Korea and the United States. In this situation, if it continues for some time, do you think there is a way for democratic countries, yours, that have embassies in Pyongyang and diplomatic relations with North Korea to open the door to positive dialogue with North Korea? So,
I do. I think from the I mean the perspective of what can embassies do on the ground, and it's not a very encouraging example, but the fact that Alexander Matsugora stayed in Pyongyang as ambassador for Russia throughout the pandemic, I think was part of the preparation that Russia found that it had made for the changed relationship. I think it would now be very difficult to disrupt that relationship or to reverse the relationship by Western contact. But actually having different voices speaking in Pyongyang would be better than not having different voices speaking in Pyongyang. And certainly you can, if North Korea is prepared to respond, I mean, you can open up some form of dialogue. I mean, we had dialogue when we were there before, and I would say that we probably even nudged some things along, even if we didn't make a fundamental difference to the direction of travel. So yeah, that's how I see it.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I believe that yes, of course, presence of Western embassies is important, and it can help to change things. And I think one should always remember that North Korea is not a monolithic country. It has 25 million people. It has many people that do not agree with the government, and also many high-ranking people. They are just subdued now. They are under pressure, of course, and it's dangerous to emit their opinions, but they are there. And so just being there and talking with people, one can, I believe, reinforce their position and reinforce their arguments in the internal discussions that there might still be. I don't know if there are any discussions right now and in what form they take place, but I think the mere presence of people that with the time are deemed trustworthy by them is important. And therefore I believe I also personally believe that the US and Japan, as has South Korea done already, should offer officially to open up liaison offices in Pyongyang unconditionally, without strings attached, simply to be present there and simply to try to influence people and establish a secure communication channel. Of course, this offer would be refused under the actual circumstances, but still it should be made, and it would, I believe, be a much more promising venue to modify North Korea's behavior than the top-down approach used during Trump's first presidency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to add on the U.S. side, kind of for our audience, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, in the agreed framework in the 1990s, the U.S. and the DPRK did agree to open up a liaison office, an intersection. I think certainly on the U.S. side, the model was at least implicitly something like we had with the PRC, start with that and then move towards full diplomatic relations. That's a different time now, of course. That's like 30 years ago. But at that time, and I had a colleague who actually went to England to study Korean for a while and was going to go as our first representative of that liaison office. But the North Koreans never let that happen. And there was the theory then that they already had a presence in New York. They didn't really see a big upside in having more Americans snooping around Pyongyang.
Yes, they would not accept it, but still, I really honestly have never understood why Washington has not reiterated it all the time.
Yeah.
They have always said, look, we are willing to negotiate at any place, anywhere in the world, anytime. But why not simply say, look, let's open up offices. You're welcome in Washington, if we are welcome in Pyongyang. And they could do it. And it would be a clear sign to establish who is to blame for this lack of communication.
Yeah. I think as all of us as former career diplomats, we're all in favor of there's still no substitute for, as we have this webinar, for being physically present in a place and living there, however constricted it might be, however challenging, and developing those relationships to the extent that you can. It's always significant. I'm going to go to a question by Donna Knox and expand it slightly because it goes to the question of humanitarian. We talked about that earlier. You referred to it, but what kinds of humanitarian exchanges or other exchanges or operations might be, attractive to Pyongyang now, might be permitted? Donna is asking in particular about, do you see any indication that DPRK will reopen for the resumption of joint recovery operations in search of American servicemen remains left behind after the Korean War? Is there anything for Pyongyang to gain in reopening to allow these humanitarian operations, but I would add, or any others you can think of in the current circumstances?
I very much agree with some of the things that Thomas has already said about North Korean attitude towards investment and towards humanitarian assistance. And I think that that there is a limitation on the extent to which North Korea is transactional. It's often said to be transactional in its relationship with Russia, but I think it is only prepared to accept investment or aid where it thinks it can do so without threatening its longer term interests. I mean, I'm pleased that we've seen the renewal of vaccination programs, even though there aren't international officials from the UN there to administer it. I can imagine that there are some other areas of assistance that on their own terms that the North Koreans would be prepared to see resume, but it's kind, it's up to them in a way. I mean, the UN has been knocking on the door to send people back. I mean, I think that the willingness for countries to give aid to North Korea is quite limited, but there are bodies and areas where the aid would be forthcoming if it could come in. In terms of joint recovery of remains, I don't see that starting again anytime soon. But I don't think that it's an ideological threat to the regime to do it. So if you did get into a point where you had some re-engagement with the United States, which is a long way off at the moment, then that is one thing that might happen. It's certainly a lot more likely to happen than Kim Jong-un signing up again to denuclearization.
Thomas,
I have nothing to add, I guess.
yeah. Let me just then add on that a little bit. What about, I mean, it always struck me that, I know in North Korea and South Korea, education and educating your children is such a kind of a prime directive. It is for any parent, I suppose, but very strong in, if I can say, Korean culture. And I wonder, I mean, I don't even know, are there any, do you see any openings, or are there any still projects that do allow North Korean students to study outside the DPRK? I was obviously in China or Russia, but what about the education side of it?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Among the programs we closed down when I was ambassador was the Chevening Scholarship Program, and we closed it down because we several times awarded Chevening scholarships for people to study in the UK, and in the end they were not allowed to go. And I wasn't going to spend any more embassy time on it, when the consequence of this was that scholarships were lost that could have been given elsewhere. I think that the controls over people going abroad to study are such that much as they might like to, they're not going to get much opportunity to do it outside Russia and China for a while, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be. I'm not aware of any North Korean students in Germany anymore. Of course, we also have these kind of programs, and we but they have all been shut down as far as I know. And I would agree with Alastair that actually it's more a question of the regime allowing people to study outside than vice versa.
Yeah, yeah.
I remember, if I may, during the COVID, no, not during the Ebola epidemic in 2014-15. My wife and we were restricted and under semi-quarantine and quarantine in Pyongyang. My wife got kind of fed up with it, and she speaks Chinese, and so she decided to study Chinese in intensive course in Dandong, in the University of Dandong, and for 2 or 3 months, and she went there, and she was learning Chinese with about 20 other students, all of them North Koreans, and they all wanted and they spoke Chinese very well already, and they all intended to go on to Dalian, to the Trade University of Dalian later on. But I doubt very much that nowadays these things happen again, because are still happening, because simply said, the leadership is not interested as much they do not want to expose that many people to foreign ideas and contacts anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Seth has reappeared, which means we're coming to the end of time, but the end of our time. But I'm going to ask you a final thing. And I actually, when people ask me about my previous postings, I find it hard, but I'm going to do it to you. And that is, I mean, looking back, what's most kind of almost memorable, maybe it's even in a personal way, in terms of living in Pyongyang? This is such an unusual experience you've each had living in the DPRK, whether it's positive or not so, but I mean something that really sticks with you and from those years.
When I left North Korea, I thought I wouldn't miss it, but I found that for the next 6 months or a year at least, when I saw news reports about North Korea. I just wanted to be back on the streets or in the areas that were being filmed because it had been interesting to be there and to see it. I think my abiding positive memory of North Korea was just came from just being able to move about among ordinary citizens of Pyongyang in particular, and sort of listen into their conversations as they talked about things like schooling or business arrangements, and they went about. And we also had kindness from our North Korean staff. My wife broke a leg at one point, broke an ankle at one point, and they were very considerate. So at that human level, I have some pleasant memories. I can't say I miss diplomacy in Pyongyang very much, but it wasn't much fun in New York on the panel of experts either.
Thank you.
I
New Yorkers aren't so kind sometimes either.
Well, that wasn't the problem.
Okay.
for me, it's I think from a human side, yes, it was it was touching for me to see how essential things of other people's life can be made difficult by others, and that was so I think the regime and it was hard to bear, to accept it, and it got harder over the years because we felt I felt more in solidarity with more and more in solidarian with the North Korean people. From a professional point of view, I found this day very rewarding because in no other posting I had such a strong feeling of doing something useful. You know, you can be an ambassador or a diplomat in other countries and do the usual stuff, but in North Korea, I always have the feeling this is some task that very few people can undertake actually, and so what I'm doing is having an impact somewhere, and this I found and I still do find rewarding, and I still consider my postings to Pyongyang as the most successful, really, in my career.
Well, thank you both so much, Ambassador Schäfer and Ambassador Morgan. This has been, for me, and I think for the audience, I'm sure, a very useful and illuminating discussion, and I hope we can continue it. So thank you to NCNK. Back over to you, Seth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Stevens and other ambassadors, Ambassador Morgan and Ambassador Schäfer. If you're in the audience today and you're interested in staying connected, we hope you'll check out more North Korea content, past and present, on the National Committee on North Korea's official YouTube channel, which will include a recording of today's webinar to catch what you may have missed. Additionally, another heartfelt shout out to my NCNK colleagues for helping to make today's webinar possible. And finally, one more big thank you to both our moderator and guest speakers for sharing so much with us today. This concludes today's webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.